Thank you, juniors, for coming in and sitting down front with us. We appreciate it. We really have a very special treat today. We have two illustrious members of the Principia community here, and I think you will enjoy what you will hear from them. Howard Bay and Clark Beim-Esche. Mr. Bay, of course, you know, is chairman of our Principia Upper School History Department, and Mr. Beim-Esche, or Mr. Beim, taught here for many years. Currently, he is writing a book. He said it's almost finished, about his visits to over 70 presidential homes that he has titled, Calling on the Presidents, Tales Their Houses Tell. Mr. Bay is going to speak with us about the Declaration of Independence, and Mr. Beim will speak about the Bill of Rights. These speeches and their documents that you will receive afterward are gifts to us from the Donald L. Koch Foundation, whose mission is to help students keep ever fresh in mind the priceless legacy of liberty which we have inherited. And Mr. Koch and his wife are both here with us today, and we're grateful to have them here for this. For this presentation on our founding documents. Mr. Bay.
Well, good morning. All right. What you're looking at is the National Archives building in Washington, D.C., preserved in specially designed, light-resistant, titanium-lined cases, and monitored by security guards in the cathedral-like rotunda of the National Archives lie the most famous documents in U.S. history: the Declaration of Independence and the United States Constitution. Millions of people have passed by these founding documents with not only a kind of profound reverence, but also a high level of confidence that they are in fact knowledgeable about what is in them. Are you one of the well-informed? How well do you know the stirring words contained in the Declaration? Are you knowledgeable about the rights guaranteed you in the Constitution? Ironically, the manuscripts on display in our nation's capital are so faded that the only legible parts in the text of the Declaration are the words that are in capital letters: United States of America and free and independent states. The United States of America, now that's a term that had not ever been used in any public document before this. In fact, no document prior to 1776 had ever been called a Declaration of Independence. Even more surprising, the word independence does not appear anywhere in the text. The most convincing case for declaring independence had actually come 6 months earlier in the closing pages of Thomas Paine's best-selling pamphlet, Common Sense. He argued that nothing can settle our affairs so expeditiously as an open and determined Declaration of Independence. Now, Thomas Jefferson's Declaration simply began like this: in Congress, July 4th, 1776, a declaration by the representatives of the United States of America in General Congress assembled. And its first paragraph reads, when in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. The document then goes on to enumerate 27 grievances justifying the desperate measures of revolution, and as intended, reports of American independence traveled quickly across the ocean, with the full text appearing in London newspapers as early as August of 1776. Newspapers in Edinburgh, Dublin, Madrid, Vienna, Copenhagen, Florence, and Warsaw quickly followed. The Declaration's primary purpose, as its chief author, Thomas Jefferson, would later recall, was to appeal to the tribunal of the world, to justify ourselves in the independent stand which we are compelled to take, to place before mankind the common sense of the subject in terms so plain and firm as to command their assent. What were these plain terms? And why did Jefferson use the words common sense? Was it common sense? The primary purpose of Paine's pamphlet by that time and by that name had been to persuade the American colonies to throw off British rule. But Paine also believed that Americans had it within their power to begin the world over again. What did he mean by that? I believe Thomas Jefferson had the answer. Jefferson would not only declare that the colonies to be outside the authority of the British Empire, a Declaration of Independence, found in the first paragraph of the document, he would also inspire future generations to begin the world over again in his stirring second paragraph. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. A very well-known phrase. But what is a self-evident truth? Well, a truth is irrefutable. A self-evident truth requires no proof. It's self-evident. And Jefferson then is acknowledging an incontestable fact, that all men have an undeniable right to life, to liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that these rights are unalienable, meaning that they are God-given. And Jefferson's second paragraph states unequivocally that all men are born with these rights. They can't be forfeited. Now, these are inspiring words, and they're what most Americans think of when they are asked about the meaning of the Declaration of Independence. Indeed, few words can sum up the American creed as succinctly as the rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. However, the historical evidence shows that only a handful of those 18th century newspapers even commented on the second paragraph with its claims of natural rights. The press of Jefferson's time focused solely on the first paragraph. Nevertheless, the signing of the Declaration on July 4th, 1776, would inspire other countries to do the same. And in fact, if we fast forward through the next 2 centuries, there will be more than 100 declarations of independence issued around the globe. From South America to Africa, and from Asia to Eastern Europe, on behalf of newly formed states. And though many imitated the Declaration of Independence with its list of grievances, very few contained a declaration of individual rights that paralleled the second paragraph of the American Declaration. Instead, most just took only the first paragraph as their template, and most of them overlooked the self-evident truths so important to our founding fathers. Think of what that means. The men who affixed their names to the Declaration bestowed on our charter a special standing in the world, a uniqueness, nurtured and promoted a sense of exceptionalism. And though the authors of the Declaration had claimed independence only for themselves and not for anyone else, they were also visionaries who had endowed the United States with a mission in the world. And Jefferson was such a missionary, a visionary. Just 2 weeks before his passing, on the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, July 4th, 1826, Jefferson called the Declaration an instrument pregnant with the fate of the world. And he then wrote the following prophetic words: "Our fellow citizens, after half a century of experience and prosperity, continue to approve the choice we made. May it be to the world what I believe it will be to some parts sooner, to others later, and finally to all, the signal of arousing men to burst the chains and to assume the blessings and security of self-government. Even Abraham Lincoln admitted that the assertion that all men are created equal was actually of no practical use in effecting our separation from Great Britain, and it was placed in the Declaration not for that, but for its future use. All honor to Jefferson, Lincoln would later say, who had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth applicable to all men at all times. And history shows that many of Lincoln's speeches invoke Jefferson's preamble as a pledge that Americans were honor-bound to fulfill. And certainly no one fought harder for the passage of the 13th Amendment, eliminating slavery. But as you can see, our founders favored a republican form of government, and in a republic, the citizens are the ruling class. I'm often surprised to hear that Americans today think of themselves as subjects of the government, instead of thinking of elected officials as their public servants. Whether elected or appointed, these public servants are simply citizens in office, temporarily serving a term in office, but citizens are citizens for life. And as citizens, we have a personal duty, some would say a moral obligation, to understand as well as possible the founding documents of our nation. In a recent survey, 71% of Americans incorrectly believed that this phrase, all men are created equal, appeared in our Constitution rather than in the Declaration of Independence. And in another survey, 1 in 3 Americans thought the Declaration of Independence was written after the Civil War. Now, the ability to memorize the precise language of the Declaration or the Bill of Rights should not be our only standard for judging who is and who is not an informed citizen. However, how thankful we can be to the Koch Foundation that believes that these documents are more than just civic classics. They're living documents, and we will all be better, happier citizens if we know something about their history and their present meaning. So here are some questions you could be asking yourself. Does my generation really know how important the principles put forth in the Declaration are to the world? How often do we think about that? Or do we just take it for granted? According to the Freedom of the World survey done by Freedom House, there are 123 electoral democracies in the world today. And as you can see in this map, those 123 countries are colored in blue. So of the almost 200 countries in the world, only 60% are free. Does 60% seem about right to you? Or do you think the number should be higher? So in closing, let's recognize that what came into existence on July 4th, 1776, has certainly inspired future generations in the world's inhabitants determined to declare their independence and be free. But we must be ever vigilant about those rights. The Declaration of Independence really doesn't guarantee a thing, but it led to this: the U.S. Constitution and its indispensable Bill of Rights, and its unforgettable opening line, "We the people." So now please welcome my esteemed colleague, Mr. Clark Beim-Esche, who will continue the story of our founding documents.
May you all have the opportunity to follow Mr. Bay. As he just said, the Bill of Rights, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence didn't accomplish anything. We had a war to fight. And as you remember from your history this year, that war lasted 7 years. The key moment, of course, was in 1781 when Cornwallis surrendered. And a couple of years later, we got that independence that we'd been looking for. But the question remained, just what were we? And in 1783, you can make a very good case that we were not the United States, that we were the United States. States were individually sovereign. The Congress, which was supposed to be in charge of our government under the Articles of Confederation, had no power to tax. They could ask states for money. For any law to be passed, 9 out of 13 of the colonies had to agree. It frankly wasn't working. Those people who cared about the future of the United States said, we've got to stop being the United States. There was a thought in France that they should send 13 ambassadors to our country, 1 for each colony. How would we become the United States? And the answer to that question resulted in a meeting, a 4-month-long meeting. And I'd like you to imagine what it would be like in this room if there were no air conditioning and all the doors were closed for 4 months. For 4 months, in the Constitutional Convention, these men worked out what becomes known to us, that wonderful document that Mr. Bay just talked about, the Constitution. It established a bicameral Congress. You all know about this. It established an executive, a president. It established a federal judiciary, the legal occupation that on the federal level that had not been present in the earlier document. But then something funny happens, and this is where I really want your attention, because I'm going to lead you to a question that will make this little assembly more than just another school assembly. I think Mr. Bay was trying to do that too. Some of the members here, who are pretty well known, Richard Gary, you may not have heard his name, but he was a signer of the Constitution. He was in the Second Continental Congress. He was a hugely important member of the Massachusetts delegation, supporting the Declaration and also present at the Constitutional Congress. George Wythe, who was a lawyer, who taught a young man named Thomas Jefferson the law and was revered throughout Virginia. George Mason, another Virginian who had personally written the Virginia Declaration of Rights. Edmund Randolph, who was the sitting governor of the state of Virginia and who would become the first, become Secretary of State and become the first Attorney General of the United States. These guys who were at the convention said, we can't sign this Constitution. They've been working at it for 4 months. And they said, we won't sign it. And they weren't alone. Around the country, as word got out about this Constitution, Richard Henry Lee, who was the first Virginian to ask for independence. Sam Adams, one of the Sons of Liberty in Boston, wouldn't back the Constitution. Patrick Henry, the Virginian who in a church in Richmond had given that wonderful call, give me liberty or give me death, would not support this Constitution. Even a young Virginian named James Monroe, who would become our 5th president ultimately, could not back the Constitution as written in 1787. Why not? What was troubling these men so much that after all that work, they wouldn't have fixed their names to the document? It lacked answers. It lacked answers to 2 questions all these men had. What specifically was it that this constitutional government was not going to be allowed to do? We could pause for a long time and think about the meaning of that question. When you establish something, do you ever think about, okay, I know what we're establishing, but what aren't we establishing? That's what they wanted, because they wanted to know about those inalienable rights that Mr. Bay talked to you about. They wanted to know, what effect will this new Constitution have to protect those rights? What they wanted has become known as a Bill of Rights. But the Bill of Rights don't give you any rights. What the Bill of Rights really is a list of limitations. Here's how a modern historian, actually two modern historians, identify the importance of this, Christopher and James Collier, in their book about the Constitutional Convention. From a certain point of view, the Bill of Rights is the most important part of the Constitution because it sets marked and dramatic limits to what the American government can do. And don't miss this, limits that in 1787 were found in no other government in the world. It is equally true today. Very few governments in their constitutions have any kind of list of what it is the government isn't allowed to do. They focus on, well, what's the government going to do? Who's going to be in charge of what? These 8 men wanted that list. And James Madison was willing to give it to them. He pens what will become the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. And I put this in modern language to make sure that we get the extraordinary thing that these articles are. Who gives you the right of free speech? That's actually a question. Who gives that to you? Does the Bill of Rights? Who gives you the right to practice your religion? Does the Bill of Rights? No. Thomas Jefferson's answer was, you're a capital C creator. So what does the Bill of Rights do? Here's the first one. The Congress may not make any law that establishes religion, limits your freedom of speech, limits the freedom of the press, limits your right to gather, limits your right to petition. It doesn't give you that right. It takes the right away from Congress to limit you. And that's how every single amendment in the Bill of Rights basically is phrased. The Congress may not make any law that infringes on the rights of citizens to bear arms. Doesn't mean that you can do irresponsible things with them, but they saw that as a right. Congress may not make any law that forces citizens to house soldiers. This was something that perhaps is more the 18th century, but they'd just been through this with lots of times British soldiers being housed in American homes, and they thought that that was unacceptable, unconscionable. The Congress may not make any law that permits unreasonable searches. They can't search your house. They can't search your computer. They can't issue warrants unless they have some sort of probable cause. This government is actually quite limited. Congress may not make any law that allows them to arrest you without an indictment, try you same time for the same crime twice, forces you to incriminate yourself, takes your property without compensating you for it. The government is not allowed to do that, according to the Fifth Amendment. You can't be denied the right to a speedy and public trial. The Congress can't make a law that would permit a biased jury. The Congress can't make a law which denies you the right to trial by jury in most cases, unless they're really cheap. The Congress may not make any law that allows excessive bail or fines you excessively or permits cruel and unusual punishment. And then my 2 favorite amendments of all. And this will show you just how seriously James Madison and the people who ultimately passed this Constitution wanted the government to be limited. Number 9, you never hear about number 9 and number 10, but I want you to know about them. Number 9, the Congress may not make any law that abridges any rights not specifically mentioned in the Constitution. In other words, you may have natural rights that aren't listed in the Declaration, that aren't mentioned in the Constitution, but that doesn't mean that the Congress has the right to infringe upon those rights. And then, probably in some ways, the most controversial one these days, Congress may not make any law that assumes powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution. Read that Constitution. Know what powers are delegated to it. Congress may not make any law that fails to acknowledge that such powers, that is, powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, are reserved to the states or to you. Nothing like this had ever been written before as a condition for a governing document like the Constitution to go into force. And now I have to ask you my question, and I will not give you an answer, because you are young men and women who very soon will be active parts of this process. But they're questions which you need to ask yourself. Do we have a government with clearly defined limits to its power? Should we? These men believed with all their hearts that without such limits, even the Constitution that they had slaved over for 4 months in a hot room in the summer wasn't good enough. Mr. Bay has acknowledged the fact that many of our founding documents, and the Bill of Rights is certainly one, have become faded over the years. Happily, the copy you will get of the Bill of Rights is much more legible today. Will we, I include me, be sure to look at this document closely and often and act to ensure that these limits will never be forgotten? The alternative is a slow fade. Thanks for your attention. To help you in this, Mr. Koch is going to help us give out copies, very nice, frameable copies, of both the Declaration, which is a reproduction of what the document actually looks like, and the Bill of Rights, which includes much more readable articulations of the 10 rights that we talked about. And that'll conclude our presentation. So if the juniors would form a line just perhaps down this aisle.